Hey everybody, this is Vegan Theology, episode 42 with Kevin and Sarah Hale.
Hi everybody.
Hey, so we're going to begin looking at a philosopher, Lisa Kemmerer. We're going to begin looking at her book, Animals and World Religions.
Yes.
And I think this has been a topic that we've thought of discussing. I know many times we say we're vegan theology, and of course, our background's really Christian theology, and even among that, Protestant Christian theology. So this is us being curious about other world religions and what they might have to say about animals and God or the spiritual life.
Yeah, and if you come from a fundamentalist / very conservative evangelical background like we do,
Right.
we feel like we have to say a word of sort of justification for why we would even want to explore other theologies of other religions.
Right.
Like, it feels just slightly dangerous or
Right.
borderline heretical
Yeah.
to even want to
This
know.
is us being risky.
So here are a few reasons that we wanted to dive into this topic. I think I was at Moody Bible Institute the first time I heard someone say, all truth is God's truth. And that quote is credited to St. Augustine. As I went through my bachelor's degree at Moody Bible Institute, that quote kept coming up and began to resonate with me more and more. That no matter what the source, no matter whose mouth it comes out of,
Right.
no matter what philosophy it comes out of or religion it comes out of, if it's truth with a capital T, it is God's truth.
Right.
Therefore, we can embrace it, we can accept it, we can implement it, we can embody it.
Right.
We don't need to be afraid of capital T truth just because it didn't come out of the mouth of a vetted Christian that we align with perfectly or,
Right.
near perfectly. So yeah, all truth is God's truth. And to believe that the American church in 2024, or for that matter, the church universal, to believe that the church has a monopoly on capital T truth seems dangerous.
Yeah.
At best to me. Or to put that another way, to believe that God has only given God's truth to one group of people
Right.
and left the rest of the world in utter darkness seems highly suspect.
It does.
Especially given the theology of God's character that we've been developing. Boundless love, boundless generosity,
Right.
boundless redemption.
For me, when I hear that, especially after the last episode we just did and thinking about marginalized people and that God is the God of the oppressed, the moment anybody or any group says, oh, the only way is our way, or the only way is this way, just on the surface, before we even get to the content, the structure of it, the form of it seems to incite a little bit of fear and domination and power.
Yeah, superiority.
Yeah, all those things. And so we're not betraying our faith. We are just acknowledging that, I think what you just said already, all truth is God's truth. And if it's true, God is the creator of truth, and God is the creator of this world. So if it's true, ultimately, he is the author of it.
Yeah.
The Logos.
A Christian universalist perspective, and again, this is not to say that we have completely studied and have a full comprehension of even what a Christian universalist perspective is, or that we claim to adhere to that perspective, but a Christian universalist perspective would certainly value the truths to be found in other faith traditions. If you recall, when we covered the chapter in Rilera's book that dealt with 1 John and Hebrews, Rilera said that according to the epistle of 1 John, Jesus reconciled all of creation to God, and it is not contingent in any way on any individual's belief in that reconciliation. Like, it's just done.
Interesting, yeah.
And it's not up to how well you understand it or how well you accept it or profess it perfectly. It's just Jesus has reconciled all of creation to God.
Right. And that, I do remember that. There were at least 2 places in that book, in Rolera's book, that came across that way that I remember. And yeah, it's pretty remarkable when Scripture itself is potentially pushing a kind of universalism. And I think in the little bit we have studied about it, a lot of the early church fathers were Christian universalists. I mean, Christian universalism was more popular in like the 2nd, 3rd centuries of the Christian faith than it is now. So
yeah, we know that there's contemporary theologians in the Orthodox tradition and others, I'm sure, that still hold to a Christian universalism.
yeah.
Something more that we need to dive into. This conversation also reminds me of something I've heard Kojin Bohannik say. Kojin Bohannik is a professor who teaches primarily the Dharmic traditions. And I heard him interviewed on his wife's podcast, Hope Bohannik. I think it's called Hope for the Animals.
Hope for the Animals.
And he was speaking of what he calls holy envy, where in his classes he encourages his students of all faiths to have holy envy as they learn about other faith traditions. The idea that we can love and appreciate aspects of other faith traditions and be inspired to bring those aspects into our own faith tradition because they're beautiful. To be like, oh, I wish my faith experience, my faith community practiced some of these things that are up here in other faith traditions. Hypothetically speaking, a person could say, I feel like my faith tradition is a little bit lacking in this one aspect, and I would like to bring that in to my faith experience. So this idea of holy envy, that we can learn from other people's faith. Also, if, as Kemmerer suggests, or as Kemmerer argues in this book, if all major world religions actually agree that we are to care benevolently and compassionately for animals, then perhaps this is one of the truths that is actually written on our hearts as a species. In other words, if we find that across all major world religions, there's something they all agree on, isn't that something that we should pay attention to?
Yeah.
Isn't that something that we should say, all world religions say basically the same thing about something? That seems like it's a universal truth that we should value. So in summary, we would just say that there is truth and value to be found in other traditions' theologies. This book, as Kevin mentioned, is titled Animals and World Religions by Lisa Kemmerer. And who is Lisa Kemmerer? Lisa Kemmerer is an American academic who has written on animal ethics and environmental ethics. She was an associate professor of philosophy and religion at Montana State University, Billings.
Woohoo!
This is something we did not know until a couple of weeks ago.
I know. I can't believe it.
I was actually preparing a Vegan's Almanac episode because we were going to highlight the publication of one of Dr. Kemmerer's books. And as I was preparing that episode, of course, I was looking up who she is. And I remember Kevin's my data guy. He loves information. He always knows the facts about people, where they studied, what they've published, where they're teaching. And he's not just like that about academics. He's like that about celebrities and musicians. And like he just knows data. He's my data guy. And so the fact that he had never told me that Lisa Kemmerer was teaching in Billings, when I found that, I was like, Kevin, does Lisa Kemmerer teach in Billings? And he just looked at me like, shut up. And so we looked it up, and yes, according to Wikipedia or wherever I was looking.
Even Montana State University's website. She's professor emeritus now.
Yeah. I reached out to her the next day just to let her know, hey, we highlighted you on Vegan's Almanac. Here's a link. And I can't believe you teach in Billings because we live in Bozeman. And she graciously responded, was so warm. And she's like, oh, I wish we would have connected when I lived in Billings. I recently retired. She has since moved to take care of her mom. But yeah, she was so gracious and warm in her emails to us. And we think there's a pretty good possibility that we're going to get to interview her when we get through this book. All right. So let's see. Where was
Go Montana.
I know.
Yeah.
Who would have thought? She's internationally known for her intersectional work in animal ethics. She's written a dozen books, including Eating Earth, Animals and the Environment, Animals and World Religions. That's the book we're talking about. Sister Species, Speaking Up for Animals, Primate People, Call to Compassion, Bare Necessities, Curly Tails and Cloven Hooves, and In Search of Consistency. I like that title.
Yeah, me too.
She is founder and director of the educational nonprofit Tapestry of Peace. And here's a quote from the introduction to her book, Sister Species, which to me harkened back to our last episode. Quote, oppressions, then, are by definition linked by common ideologies, by institutional forces, and by socialization that makes oppressions normative and invisible.
Wow.
So again, this idea that all oppression is, in fact, the same thing.
Yep.
All right, so that's a little bit about who Dr. Kemmerer is. Today, we're going to be discussing the foreword and the introduction of this book. And then we'll take the next couple of months to work through the 7 chapters. So each chapter is going to focus on a world religion and their theologies around animals. So next episode will be about indigenous traditions, and then we'll go into Hindu, and then Buddhist. After Buddhist will be Chinese, and then we go into Jewish, and then Christian, and then Islamic traditions. So I'm excited.
Yeah. It's going to be an education.
Yeah. Let's get into the foreword. The foreword of this book was written by Norm Phelps. I read a book by Norm Phelps several summers ago, his Dominion of Love.
Yeah, it's a great book.
I think was my first book I read from cover to cover about animal theology. So
Norm Phelps was an American animal rights activist, vegetarian, and writer. He was a founding member of the Society of Ethical and Religious Vegetarians, also known as SERVE, and a former outreach director of the Fund for Animals. He authored 4 books on animal rights: The Dominion of Love, Animal Rights According to the Bible, The Great Compassion, Buddhism and Animal Rights, The Longest Struggle, Animal Advocacy from Pythagoras to PETA, and Changing the Game, Animal Liberation in the 21st Century. Phelps had become a vegetarian and then a vegan following the death of his dog Czar in 1984. As Phelps describes this change process on his website, Czar was a person. He had a personality as individual and well-defined as any human being. He could love, he could trust, he could share, he could enjoy, he could fear, he could worry. He could look forward to the future and remember the past. He had a sense of who he was, and he would have sacrificed himself for me without a moment's hesitation. If Czar was a person, what about other animals? What about cows, pigs, chickens, and sheep? Weren't they people too? How could we love some and eat others? Phelps supported live rescues of animals from farms and laboratories. In 1994, he was arrested at a pigeon shoot in Pikeville, Pennsylvania, for releasing 200 pigeons who were slated to become living targets. He spent 2 days in Berks County Prison and was subsequently convicted of malicious mischief.
yeah. What struck me about that is he became vegan, I think if I did my math right, at the age of 45. He went all in.
Right.
From the age of 45 until his death, he was a very committed, very active thinker, writer, activist,
Right.
even to the point that he rescued animals from death and ended up spending some time in jail and was convicted of a charge. I didn't realize that he had passed away. He writes a very good foreword for this book. It's just a 2-page long foreword, so we're just going to take a look at it. He starts out with the obvious that if organized religions were to fully include animals within the scope of their compassionate ministries, it would be a great benefit to animals.
Right.
Like millions of animals would be saved. If just Christians alone, not considering any other religions, if Christians alone stopped eating animals, it would save millions of animals a year. So that's the obvious point. But he makes a very interesting point here. He says religions would benefit just as much or more than the animals would. Religions need to reform in order to fully live into who they say they are. He says religious practitioners and religion itself would benefit spiritually as much as animals would benefit physically and emotionally.
Yeah.
He goes into how Charles Darwin made an irrefutable case demonstrating that we are fundamentally, physically, mentally, and emotionally similar to non-human animals. He says Lisa Kemmerer in this book is going to make a compelling case that according to the world's religions, that truth is known. So in science, that truth is known. In the world's religions, that truth is known, that we are so similar and share so many characteristics in all the ways that count with animals. But he says every aspect of Darwin's theory has been accepted by mainstream science except his claim that we are fundamentally similar to non-human animals. And it's not that his claim that we're similar to other animals has been refuted, it's just been ignored. And same with the religions. Nobody's ever refuted religion's major claims that we are similar to non-human animals. It's just been ignored by our practitioners of those religions and by the clergy and by the theologians within those religions.
Phelps describes this point with this statement. This fundamental similarity, Kemmerer points out, brings animals fully within the protective circle of the call of religious traditions for universal, unbounded compassion. Our religions cannot be fully realized until practitioners grant animals equal protection universally indicated by religious teachings. And this requires people to refuse to be complicit in the exploitation, abuse, and slaughter of our non-human family members. Religion needs animals to be protected as much as animals need religion to protect them, because religion that fails to protect animals fails to keep its own promise.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I really like this point. I feel like Lindsay made this point too.
Yeah.
The idea that animals need us to change, but we need to change for our own spiritual benefit.
Right.
To redeem religion, to bring religion into alignment with itself.
Right.
Religion will benefit from this change every bit as much as animals would benefit.
Right.
He goes on to say that we can't blame religion for human evil in the world. Evil is a human phenomenon, and evil is done for evil reasons, but then religion is added on later as justification after the fact.
Yeah.
But true religion that is consistent with itself conquers the forces of evil, resists the forces of evil. It's definitely a misuse of religion to justify evil by it. He mentions how we have commandeered religion as rationale for human enslavement and all kinds of abuse, not just to animals, but to humans. It's not the religion that's supporting these exploitative practices. It's that we add religion on to these exploitative practices.
Right.
And he brings the foreword to a close by saying, Isaac Bashevis Singer, Nobel laureate in literature and compassionate vegetarian for the last half century of his life, noted that scriptures include animals within the injunction to love your neighbor as yourself. Lisa Kemmerer shows us that these teachings of compassion toward all living beings spring directly from the ancient, essential heart of all major religions. The problem is that we have become accustomed to seeing our scriptures through the lens of tradition and custom. And that lens has been clouded by millennia of animal enslavement and slaughter. This book will leave you with a new and hopefully life-changing understanding of the profound message of compassion that is as unrestricted by species as it is by nationality, race, and gender, and which lies at the heart of the world's religious tradition. There's this very strong overlap between the vegan and the religious person to be committed to universal, unbounded compassion, that everybody is included within that.
Yeah.
There's nobody outside of that. Turning to Dr. Kemmerer's introduction to this book, there's a lot of good stuff in this introduction. I'm just going to read how she starts this because she's very eloquent. I love how she writes.
Right.
From the standpoint of religious traditions, what is our rightful role with regard to red-winged blackbirds and short-eared lizards? What do sacred teachings tell us about our responsibilities to bluefin tuna and black Angus cattle? Humans often dominate and exploit other creatures, Contemporary factory farming, for example, causes acute suffering, prolonged misery, and premature death to billions of non-human animals every year across continents on behalf of those who choose to eat animal products. From factory farms to medical laboratories, individuals from non-human species have become objects for our purposes and means to human ends. Technology, mass production, and the sheer number of flesh-eating humans crowded onto this planet have increased the volume and intensity of non-human animal exploitation exponentially. Most of us never see the creatures whom we dominate and exploit. Their dark eyes and steamy breath, wavy hair or intricate feathers, swaying tails or shiny beaks. We do not have the chance to know them as individuals, their preferences and fears, affections and curiosities. We only see a slab of flesh wrapped in cellophane, a bit of dairy in a plastic container with an obscure label that fails to mention the truth. This that you eat is part of someone else's body. It's a strong introduction.
Yeah.
She describes how both Tom Regan and Peter Singer, back in the 70s and the 80s, published really wonderful philosophical reasonings as to why humans need to stop abusing and killing animals. But she says, but not much has changed since their works have been made public. In fact, things have gotten worse, as she described. And she floats this theory that maybe, perhaps, people are more influenced by their religious convictions than they are by logical or moral philosophy. People's religion and their doctrines and what they're being taught from their pastors or whatever have more impact on them or more control on them or more influence, might be the best word, over them than just some philosophical, logical argument. So the idea is we need to correct what people understand about their religion. She says, as it turns out, the world's great religious teachings concur with Regan and Singer. We ought not to be exploiting non-humans as we do in our animal industries. Unfortunately, people are usually only partially aware of what is taught by their inherited religious traditions, and we tend to be highly selective as to which aspects of our sacred teachings and writings we are familiar with and those that we practice. Reading sacred literature provides insight into the human being's proper place in the universe.
Continuing on, Karl Jaspers referred to the great religious awakenings that took place in various places around the world in the first millennium BCE as the Axial Age. At this time, the world's largest contemporary religions were formed, and morality, how we behave, was placed at the heart of the spiritual life in the religions that originated in India, China, and the Middle East. The taproot of this religious/moral framework is compassion. Compassionate action became the essence of religious practice during the Axial Age. The great sages of that time, who formed each of today's major religions, placed compassion, generosity, kindness, charity, benevolence, inclusiveness, the empathic life at the core of religious teachings and practice. These sages taught that respect for the lives of all beings was the essence of religion.
That is so interesting. So is this the intertestamental period?
Yeah, I think it does match up. I was looking it up. It's from the 8th century BCE to the 3rd century BCE. And the beginning of the intertestamental period and the end of the Old Testament is in this time.
So during this time that scholars have called the Axial Age is when a lot of these, what we consider the world's religions, were being birthed.
Right.
And for the first time in human history, morality, how we behave, became the heart of spiritual life.
Right.
Okay, that's in itself is really fascinating to think about.
Right.
The fact that all of these religions, she says, the taproot of this religious moral framework is compassion. Compassionate action became the essence of religious practice during the Axial Age.
Right. And the big names of this time are Buddha, Confucius, and Socrates.
Yeah, and we know that Buddha was spreading basically veganism.
Right.
It wasn't called that yet.
Right.
And we know that a lot of the Greek philosophers, maybe including Socrates to some degree, were also wrestling with veganism
Right.
and how we treat animals.
Pythagoras, but then others, Epicurus and Pyrrho, were two Greeks that shared Buddhist ideas in their thinking. So it seems like there was a lot going on in that time.
I know.
The Axial Age, yeah. All right, we're going to continue on with a paragraph from the introduction. Scholar and author Kimberly Patton from Harvard Divinity School, when asked in a recent interview, commented that religious traditions contain extremely long and rich and ancient commentaries on the topic of animals. They are very interested in animals as existential beings, and this goes back centuries, millennia even. She notes that every religious tradition provides followers with very rich resources for seeing animals more as theological subjects than as objects, and that contemporary mainstream responses which ignore the desperate plight of non-human animals are largely ignoring their own heritages. Author, scholar, and activist Paul Waldo, when asked which religions are the most animal-friendly, replied without pause, all the ones that are listening to their heart.
Yeah. The fact that she's saying the common core of major religions, they all have a lot to say about animals as theological subjects,
Yeah,
not objects. But again, this has been ignored.
right.
Obviously, we're resonating with this.
Yeah. Unfortunately, as we know, religion has been co-opted by power and by all the things we've already mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah, I think as this goes on, I think she starts using the phrase status quo. We're so prone to just maintaining the status quo that is so much more powerful. That pull to maintain status quo is so much more powerful than actually thinking about how we need to change.
Right.
Moving on, Waldo notes that religions sometimes move in directions that prompt and motivate the masses toward a great expansion of justice and ethics. While religions have different worldviews, different prophets and saints, different conceptions of the spiritual forces of the universe, religions tend to share core moral ideals, core conceptions of what is right and wrong, good and bad behavior. This is not surprising given that peoples around the world cannot live in community if they murder, steal, and lie. Certain core moral ideals must be upheld in order to maintain social structures. Consequently, religions tend to foster moral principles that allow us to live comfortably and peacefully with one another. Whether termed ahimsa, metta, karuna, chi, or love, for example, the world's largest and oldest religious traditions teach people that we must protect the weak and needy from cruelty, exploitation, and indifference. Most of us are aware of these core spiritual teachings and their application with regard to human beings, though we often fail to put this knowledge into action. But few people seem to understand the application of such pervasive religious moral injunctions with regard to fishes and mice, hogs and horses, turkeys and elephants.
I do love how she equates ahimsa, metta, karuna, chi, and love here. I think that's good. That brings things into focus.
Right, I agree. She addresses the fact that, as we know, within each of these religions, right, there's a great diversity of thought and opinions. Like within Christianity alone, there's all kinds of denominations and interpretations and doctrines. But she says if we look carefully at each of these religions and their sacred texts and who says them and how often things are said, things start to come into focus in terms of what are the core theological ideas. And so in spite of this diversity of accumulated religious lore, it is possible to locate a preponderance of core teachings that point to a particular moral outlook, which can be discerned by examining texts, the lives of moral exemplars, and long-standing, deep-rooted, foundational religious ideal. This volume does not focus on the many differences among branches of a given religion, such as that of Mahayana and Theravada Buddhists, Sunni or Shia Muslims, Orthodox or Reformed Judaism, or that of Protestant and Catholic Christians. Rather, this work focuses on core teachings within each religious tradition that reach across sectarian boundaries, like ahimsa in Buddhist tradition or love in Christian tradition.
Right. Something she emphasizes in this book is that she's interested in those core values across all these religions. She's not necessarily interested in what Christians believe on the street, street level, or practice, because one of the things she mentions here, and what I think Norm Phelps mentioned, is that what we say we believe and what we do are two different things.
Right.
And so let's get back to the core values, because our religion has been co-opted. We always talk about peace and love, and yet we're not treating animals with peace and love.
Yeah. Or fellow humans, for that matter.
Correct.
Right. And then she describes what she's going to focus on within each religion. So we're going to see subheadings within each chapter. For example, Sacred Nature, Sacred Animals focuses on religious teachings that instruct people on rightful relationship with the ecosystems and the environment. And then Philosophy and Morality in each chapter will establish rightful relations between humans and all other creatures, relationships between the divine and non-humans, and relationships between humans and non-humans. That's going to be divided into some categories. Non-humans as individuals in their own right, and what each religion says about the kinship between humans and non-human animals. And in some of the chapters, she's going to be talking about interpenetrability and what she means by that. This concept is particularly important to religious traditions that offer a cyclical vision of life, such as reincarnation, transmigration. In traditions in which individuals might be reborn as a non-human animal, there is no definitive line between different creatures. There is no eternal or ultimate distinction between humans and the rest of the animate world. In contrast, religions that do not hold a cyclical vision of life do not generally include species interpenetrability. She also has sections in each chapter about animal powers, which will examine special abilities that are attributed to non-humans in sacred stories and literature in that religion, including their creative powers, their spiritual devotion, their special knowledge, and their ability to assist and teach human beings. And then the final section of each chapter will focus on animal activists from that religious tradition who are motivated by religious belief. These activists are driven by religious commitments, their spiritual understanding of what constitutes rightful relations between humans and other creatures, and by their knowledge of how contemporary flesh, entertainment, lab animal, and clothing industries violate religiously prescribed rightful relations between humans and non-human animals. The more I read this, the more I get excited.
Right.
Like, this is going to be an amazing book. She has a section here about how she's not going to spend time giving counter arguments, because counter arguments within religions on why we shouldn't care about animals are plenty.
Right.
Easy to find. We've all been raised on them.
Oh, we hear them. We hear them all the time.
Yeah.
Every day.
She says religious leaders generally share and defend the larger community's exploitative habits. I do not offer arguments in favor of animal exploitation because others can and will do so. Such arguments are easy to come by. Yeah, it's here she talks about status quo. She says, people tend to defend the status quo, their way of life, whatever their way of life might be, even when their religion is rich with teachings that convey the importance of radical social change. Force of habit and personal investment in the status quo combine to encourage humanity to turn a blind eye to animal-friendly scriptures. Yes. Nonetheless, religious traditions offer plenty of resources for countering such trends. Therefore, the abundant but often ignored resources that lie within each of the world's great religions, which have the power to transform our relations with non-humans and the earth itself, are rightly the focus of this book.
Continuing, religious arguments that are commonly posed in favor of exploiting non-humans are unconvincing in light of a richer understanding of religious teachings, writings, ideals, and exemplars. Such arguments are generally both shallow and specific. They run counter to the deepest moral convictions of religious traditions, as this book amply demonstrates. Thankfully, core religious teachings speak against factory farming and cruel exploitation in general. I encourage readers to ponder what religious arguments might be posed to defend factory farming or animal experimentation in light of the information provided herein. I also encourage readers not to draw any conclusions until they have read the entire book, including the appendix.
Yeah, I like that. I like how she's saying when religious people think that they have scripturally based arguments for the exploitation of animals, she's saying those, how does she describe that? They're
shallow and specific.
Shallow and specific. They ignore the overarching greater truths of that religion. As in, God is love. God is a God of life, not death. God is a God of flourishing, not slavery, not imprisonment, etc., etc.
Right.
God is a God of freedom. Under her next subheading, which she calls ideals, not actions, this book presents religious ideals. This volume does not attempt to explain how people within each religious tradition actually behave or what they actually believe. Compassion is a central teaching of every major religion, but most people are unaware of how animal industries operate, of how our economic choices either do or do not contribute to intense suffering and uncounted premature death. Consequently, religious teachings too often fail to affect what people actually do, what they purchase or consume. This is really cracking into, she's naming some of our critique of, I guess, the church.
Right.
Which is we have these ideals, but if we don't know how to attach those ideals or apply those ideals to real life, our purchasing choices, etc., then our ideals and our practices, our behaviors are not lining up, and that never really quite gets addressed, it seems like.
No, I agree. I mean, we could riff on this for a long time, and it's a constant frustration, I think, for both of us. And yeah, I'll just continue reading here. Sacred teachings are no more effective than the knowledge and religious commitment of practitioners. Humans can have an endless supply of noble thoughts, but if they are not accompanied by a call to action, then the ideas themselves are of little value. As it turns out, many religious people proudly claim the idealistic spiritual teachings of their faith, yet simultaneously deny that these teachings apply to their personal choice of foods, clothing, entertainment, or pharmaceuticals. For example, religious people are likely to agree that compassion is a central tenet of their religious ethics, but that there is nothing cruel about the production and consumption of milk or cottage cheese. Dairy products, they assert, do not require the taking of life, and are therefore neither cruel nor against core religious teachings. Of course, it is possible to feed and tend a nursing cow and calf without cruelty and without taking life by simply sharing a cow's nursing milk with her calf. But this mere possibility has nothing to do with the actual production of cow's milk on dairy farms. Consequently, this possibility cannot justify the consumption of yogurt, cheese, or milk purchased from local grocery stores.
She's calling out this common misconception that there can't be anything inherently cruel about dairy, for example,
right,
or eggs, because people are unaware of what actually goes on in those industries. And so there's not that connection between what we say we believe and what we can do about it.
I feel like we've made this statement so many times, and she just makes it again, right? Humans can have an endless supply of noble thoughts, but if they're not accompanied by a call to action, then the ideas themselves are of little value. And it does make me think about going to church. And we go to church and we sing these praises, we listen to these worship songs, we get all filled up, and then we go back to our status quo. It's frustrating.
Yeah. She pulls in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in a really interesting way here. She writes, Martin Luther King Jr. asked whether organized religion was, quote, too inextricably bound to the status quo to save our nation and the world. Is organized religion too inextricably bound to the status quo to offer any meaningful response to the ongoing egregious exploitation of billions of non-human animals? As long as a significant majority continues to support animal exploitation, regardless of core religious ideals, most religious people are unlikely to change. As long as a few people are willing to challenge common practices, the majority tends to feel free to continue in their habitual way, oblivious of the myriad devastating effects of their actions. Not one major religion has thus far forcefully challenged any factory farming practice. If religious traditions cannot offer a meaningful response to contemporary moral issues, such as that of animal exploitation, they risk being, quote, dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century, end quote. And that's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. again.
Wow.
There's echoes of what we talked about in our last episode, this idea that if we don't start using our ideals to address what's actually going on in this world, then we risk being irrelevant.
I think kind of what we heard from last episode and previously even with Valera, this concept of utopia building. What if we could dream about the world we want to see, but what if in that we also dreamt up ways to make it happen? Small little things. And maybe that's the whole point, right? Because we talked about when you utopia build, you dream, you also, and you start living it out, you start to find ways to make it manifest. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if the real challenge for the Christian, the modern day Christian in America, is to find ways to get out of your comfort zone, but it really is, it's get out of your status quo. What can you do to practice your agency muscle, to flex it just a little bit, just a little more than you normally would?
The next subheading is things we tend not to know. And here she makes the case that people just are unaware. They're genuinely oblivious to what is actually going on in industries that exploit animals. They have really no idea of the degree of suffering that is going on. And here she gives about a page of resources.
Yeah.
She lists several websites that show footage from different animal industries. She has a couple of videos in addition to those websites. And then she has several sites listed who are like vegan organizations who are doing something about the current situation.
Yeah.
Because, if you're unaware, then of course you don't feel compelled to do anything about it. Becoming aware is definitely key. She goes into the next section where she talks about acceptance, reform, or liberation. Basically, she's saying people have generally three choices once they become aware of what's going on. They can either accept the situation, say there's nothing wrong with it, and deny that there's any moral implications.
Right.
Or they can say, okay, there's really nothing wrong with what we're doing. We're just doing it the wrong way. So let's reform our practices. Let's make the farrowing crates larger. Let's make the battery cages bigger. Let's reform or improve the welfare.
Right.
That's your second choice. So deny or choose to try to reform things. Or the third choice is the abolitionist choice, which is total liberation, to say that, no, it's not that we're doing it the wrong way. We shouldn't be doing it at all.
Right.
And it's unnecessary to be doing it at all. She's definitely making the case that that is the appropriate choice.
Right. That is the religious choice.
How she closes that subheading really reminded me of what Valera said to us. People committed to any one of these religious traditions are obligated, at a minimum, to stop supporting factory farming, to stop buying their products. Denial will not suffice. Religious adherents must first and foremost cease to support these industries. Alternatively, religious adherents can admit that they are not particularly religious, that they really don't care what their religion teaches, and that they therefore have no intention of changing their way of life based on core religious teachings. So again, become aware and either stop supporting these industries or admit that you really don't care what your religion teaches.
Right. Which begs the question, what are you doing with your religion?
Yeah. And then we get to the last section of the introduction, which was fascinating. She gets into language. The subheading is words and social change. Right.
Yeah, I find this very fascinating section. It's pretty amazing. I just want to read the whole thing, but I don't know. I don't know how interesting that is for everybody, but this is pretty remarkable.
This section really highlights and illuminates the power of language and the power of word choices. Somewhere in here she says, we create language, but language creates us. She starts this out saying, words help to shape our understanding of the world. Language legitimizes and is made legitimate by those in power and is therefore rife with political and ideological investment. Consequently, language supports and contributes to domination and is an important medium for social control and a viable method of bringing social change. Our word choices either support the domination or support some kind of social change.
Right.
And she references Ludwig Wittgenstein, an influential Austrian philosopher. He noted that language is a moral matter. Wittgenstein believed that the job of philosophy is to sort out conceptual confusions that arise when we use language carelessly or without reflection. He considered philosophy as a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. He noted that communication, the use of language, in a meaningful manner is a speech act. Language is not simply a mirror of life, it is the doing of life itself.
Right. It also says Wittgenstein recognized language as a human creation. I thought that was very relevant to some of our past podcasts where we talk about Genesis 1. When God was done, in essence, creating the world, the creation wasn't finished. Humans, Adam, was to continue the creation by organizing and creating in things like this language. He came up with names for the animals, for instance. I just love this idea that is being put out here, that we still have the creative capacity to continue God's creation through art and ideas and words, language. Continuing on here, it says, humans need not be stymied by a lack of words. We simply create what we need. But through our created words, language reflects culture and society and simultaneously maintains a particular established way of thinking. She goes on and says, because words carry more than surface meaning, choosing new words is an important tool in the process of changing thought. All that together, I think, based on everything we've been reading and studying of late, when they say history is written by the winners, when we speak about privilege, it's the words we're choosing.
Yeah.
And she's about to show us this.
Yeah. We've kind of been tiptoeing around the perimeter of this in our own thinking and our own discussions. Right. I know I have, in the past year or so, become increasingly uncomfortable with referring to God as He, Him, even though I know our sacred text does that. Putting a gender to God is feeling more and more uncomfortable for me. And then we've also had conversations about how we refer to animals, because it's pretty typical to refer to animals as it instead of he or she. Making that choice to change that changes the conversation.
Right.
I remember when we took our firstborn to the emergency room once because she had infant jaundice. I don't know if you remember this, Kevin. The nurse kept referring to her as it. Do you remember that?
I don't.
And we were both just like so perplexed. Why are you referring to our daughter as it?
Right.
This idea that our word choices have huge impact on how we look at things.
Right.
She brings up examples that there are certain words that used to be used to refer to, for example, African Americans, that are no longer acceptable. If you use those words, you're going to get an emotional response from people.
Right.
There are certain words in our society that used to be used to refer to women, that if you were to use those words now, people would look at you like, why are you using that word?
Right.
That's not okay. And so the idea that there are choices, our word choices have so much power, and you cannot be neutral. Your word choice conveys something about your philosophy or your paradigm. You're either conveying your ignorance or your indifference or your conservatism, or you're accepting a sex-inclusive language, more of an inclusive word.
No, I really liked where she was talking about that, like when new ideas come forward and you can either accept them, reject them, or remain ignorant, but you have to make a choice.
Yeah.
That's pretty potent. That's what culture does. That's what society does. It continues to evolve, and language with it.
Yeah, right.
And ideas with that.
So she gets into what she calls lexical gaps when referring to non-human animals. There is no word in the English language to describe the category every animal outside of the speaker's species. For scholars and activists involved in animal rights, animal ethics, animal liberation, this lexical gap is problematic. The use of animals as if it referred only to non-humans is inappropriate because humans are animals, primates, mammals. As a result, several word combinations have emerged to fill this lexical gap, including non-human animal, other animals, other than human animals, and animals other than humans, or as Akbar Ali said, beyond human animals. But when writing or speaking specifically about non-human animals, such terms quickly become cumbersome. Nonetheless, authors and lecturers currently speaking and writing on subjects such as animal law or animal minds must use these cumbersome concoctions if they are to remain accurate in their speech and writing.
As well as a word like non-human animal being cumbersome, it's also dualistic, and dualistic in the sense that there's two false categories that don't really represent reality. There's humans and then everyone else or everything else. Or, we know this with a lot of times in the 60s and before the civil rights era, there was white restrooms and colored, right? It was whites and then everyone else. And so this dualism, it encourages people to assume that one category is the norm, like white, male, human, Christian, whatever. While opposites, like female, brown, animal, non-Christian, are assumed to be inferior and less desirable. And it creates divisions, controversies, competitions, malevolence, malice. It creates problems. It creates sexism. It instills these sexist, racial, speciest ideas into people's thinking.
Yeah.
They're just false categories that are exclusive in the sense.
Right.
So one of the beautiful things she does here at the end of this introduction is she introduces a new way of thinking about all of us, animals and humans. She comes up with a new word that is very inclusive, that is not creating false dichotomies in reality. So it's a wonderful word. I think it's pronounced animal.
Animal. The word any, contracted with the word animal, animal. Her definition is any animal that does not happen to be the species that the speaker or I am. It's acknowledging that we are animals,
right?
But it gives us a handy way of talking about the non-human animals without having to say other than human animals or non-human animals. We say animal.
Right.
To talk about the non-human animals. I think with a lot of things like this, when you first hear them, like, oh, don't use that word, this word is better, there's this internal resistance. At least I've experienced that.
Yeah.
But I think that she's onto something for sure.
Yeah, what's fascinating about one example she gives in this book about animals is, for instance, if another species like a chimp were to sign the word animal, animal would refer to all other animals, including humans.
Right.
But not her species, the rest of her species.
Yeah. So it means all of the animal kingdom excluding the speaker's species.
Right. Very inclusive.
Yeah. So she says how we label other living beings affects our relationship with other creatures. In short, how we speak about other animals is inseparable from the way we treat them.
Well, I've heard that before. Thinking drives behavior.
Yeah. And in this case, word choices drives thinking, which drives behavior.
She says in here, words are a form of activism. I mean, it's pretty powerful if you think about that. How much power we have in our words, that we shouldn't be taking our words for granted. And when we do speak, our words should be very well thought out and intentional.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that words are a form of activism, that's power.
Yeah. She says language ought to reflect the truth. Humans are animals. Animal does so while simultaneously opening dialogue, encouraging each of us to think about how we use animal and why we often and unknowingly use this word as if it did not include humanity. And she closes, dialogue is sparked on the subject of animal exploitation. This topic, in turn, will help us to rethink our religious commitments, our rightful place as animals among animals. Very cool.
Yeah, very neat.
Oh my goodness, I am so impressed. I love the way she writes. I'm so excited to get into this book.
Right.
This is also the first time in this podcast history, which is now just over a year long, that we are focusing on the perspective of a woman
Right.
I think it's time that we get some new perspectives, some fresh perspectives.
Yeah. And it's cool. She's from Montana.
Yeah.
And I was just looking it up just for kicks because we live in Bozeman and the mascot to our state school is a bobcat. But in Billings, the mascot is a Yellow Jacket. So
Oh, really?
go Yellow Jackets. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
A lot to think about here, especially this idea of our word choices and how that affects how we think and how we behave.
Yeah.
All right. So next episode will be about indigenous religious traditions and their views on animals. So can't wait to talk with you about that.
Yeah. It'll be fun.
Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day.
Later.